The yard went quiet when 8-year-old Lila Hart whispered, "No one wants me." And dust hung motionless there. Folks stared at their boots, pretending they hadn't heard a child sentence a lifetime with 4 little words spoken steady. The auctioneer cleared his throat like a man selling calves, then he called her lot again for mercy today alone. A farmer wanted strong boys, a couple wanted babies, and nobody wanted a thin girl holding a faceless doll tight. Lila's eyes were older than mine ever got, and I've seen gun smoke, grave dirt, and broken promises too often. Behind the crowd stood Silas Mercer, rich in land, poor in comfort, with a Colt on his hip unused yet. He hadn't come to save anyone. He'd come for coffee and nails and to leave town before sundown quietly again. Then Lila said it again, and the words hit Silas like a hammer, and his hand brushed that revolver once. If he drew wrong, men would panic, but he only stepped forward. Boots on boards, choosing trouble over silence now. Before we ride deeper into this tale, subscribe and tell me your town so I can tip my hat back. And friend, have you had a glass of water today, or are you running on coffee like Silas was too? I was leaning by the fence rail, sipping bitter coffee, watching strangers judge a child like worn tack in public. September heat pressed down hard, and the smell of horse sweat mixed with cheap perfume from town ladies nearby today. Some called it a placing day, some still called it an auction, and both names tasted mean in my mouth. Silas kept his hat low, and his face looked carved from cedar, the kind that doesn't bend for anyone alive. He had money from his late father, and he'd turned it into 15,000 acres of grazing grass alone north. Folks respected the Mercer brand, because the man paid fair wages, and he didn't cheat at the scales, ever once. What they didn't like was his quiet, and the way his big house stayed dark even on Sundays most times. A widower without a wife looks suspicious to gossips, and a bachelor with grief looks worse to them each year. Silas had lost a woman once, and after that he'd trained his heart to stay saddled and closed up tight. He told himself that solitude was a fence, and fences keep wolves out until you're the wolf inside at night. So he came for supplies, lamp oil, salt, and a sack of beans, nothing that cried or needed hugs ever. Yet the yard had its own gravity, and when children are lined up, even hard men feel it in silence. Lot numbers rang out like brands called at a sale barn, and each child climbed the platform alone too soon. Some got chosen quick by farmers needing hands, and I won't pretend that kind of choosing is gentle for kids. Silas watched 3 earlier lots, and his boots stayed planted like he'd hammered them into the dirt from habit alone. When the auctioneer read Lila's card, his voice turned smooth, trying to paint hope over bruised reality for buyers here. He said she could read, he said she was quiet, and he said she'd earn her keep indoors with care. Lila climbed up slow like a foal on ice, and the crowd measured her arms, then looked away again quietly. Her dress was patched so often the original cloth had vanished, leaving only stitches and stubbornness behind for all eyes. The doll in her fist had no face, and that blankness felt like the world had practiced on her first. She didn't beg, she didn't cry, she just stood there, shoulders squared, waiting for the next blow to land soon. A woman with lace cuffs leaned forward, then shook her head because Lila was too old to shape like clay. 2 ranchers whispered about feed costs, and they wanted boys who could swing a shovel, not a girl so small. The auctioneer tried jokes, and his laugh sounded tired because he knew the silence was winning again right this minute. He offered her cheap, saying she ate little, and that line made my stomach twist like barbed wire in anger. Silas heard that too, and his jaw clenched because he'd spent years pretending hunger was just weather to endure alone. The card said her parents had died in a city, and that kind of loss follows you westward like shadow. I saw Silas shift his weight, and I knew a decision was coming because his hands went still at last. He'd survived blizzards, stampedes, and bad markets, yet a child whispering truth can break a man faster than any bullet. When Lila said, "No one wants me," her voice didn't tremble, and that steadiness scared me most of all today. Silas stepped out from the back, and people moved aside because wealth in the West carries its own law still. He climbed the wooden steps, and each boot heel struck like a verdict, slow, firm, and unavoidable for everyone listening. The auctioneer blinked, surprised to see Mercer blood on this side of town mercy, and not profit, for once here. Silas didn't look at the crowd, he looked at Lila, and his eyes held the same empty miles as hers. How much, he asked, and his voice rasped like a gate that hadn't swung open in years until this moment. The auctioneer tried to soften it, calling it a placement fee and saying paperwork could follow later if needed, sir. Silas reached into his coat, and a few folks flinched, thinking he wanted steel, not a wallet, right then, too. He drew out bills instead, crisp enough to shame the town, and he laid them down without counting slow twice. $50 sat on the podium, and the sound of it was louder than any sermon I'd ever heard spoken. Whispers rolled through the crowd, saying Silas had finally gone soft or finally gone mad, or both at the same. Men who'd never fed a child judged him quick, because that's what small towns do. They chew stories up daily. Silas didn't argue. He just said, "Draw the papers," and his tone carried ranch authority. "Not asking for permission today." The auctioneer nodded fast, afraid the moment might break, and promised signatures within the hour for law to hold tight. Silas shook his head once, and he said, "She comes now, because waiting can turn courage into regret real quick." He turned toward Lila, and he held out his hand, palm up, like he was offering water in dry country. Lila stared at that hand, because hands have hurt her before, and trust is a thing learned slow by children. Silas kept his arm steady, and he didn't crowd her, because even a hard man can mind manners when needed. Silas asked, "You got a name besides Lila Hart?" And the crowd leaned in hungry for the answer right now. "Just Lila," she said, and her voice was so small it sounded like it might blow off in wind alone. Silas nodded, and he said, "I'm Silas Mercer, and I've got a ranch north of here, quiet rooms waiting too." He didn't say mansion. He said rooms, because lonely men don't brag. They just admit emptiness, plain to themselves sometimes. The auctioneer cleared his throat again, trying to smile, and he asked if Silas understood the arrangement for guardianship only. Silas answered, "I understand enough," and he looked back at Lila, not at the man with papers to sell kids. Lila's fingers tightened on the doll, and the cloth arm dangled like it was tired of holding on so long. Silas noticed that loose thread, and something in him remembered a childhood shirt mended by someone gone too soon back. He cleared his throat, and he asked, "You scared, kid?" "Because honesty is kinder than sugar most days right here." Lila tilted her head, thinking hard, and she said, "I don't know. Should I be scared of you today, sir?" That question cut Silas deep, because it meant the world had taught her fear, like reading step by step daily. He said, "You should be cautious, because I'm not gentle by nature, but I won't be cruel ever to you." "Will you hit me?" she asked, like she was asking about rain. And the crowd sucked in breath to listen. Silas's eyes went hard, and he said, "No, not once, not ever. Not on my worst day alive out here." He didn't raise his voice yet. Every man there heard him, because a promise said, "Low can thunder across prairie." Lila blinked, and a tear tried to form, but she held it back like she'd learned tears cost too much. Silas hated that lesson, and I hated it too, because kids ought to waste tears on small things, sometimes freely. He lowered his hand a little, giving her room, and he said, "You'll have a bed, warm blankets, and supper." He added, "You'll have a door you can close, and no one will bar it from the outside at night." Lila's shoulders loosened a hair, and that tiny change told me she'd been carrying stone inside her chest for years. The auctioneer tried to interrupt, saying rules required signatures, but Silas looked at him like frost on winter glass panes. "Send them to my ranch office," Silas said. He finally nodded toward the road, ready to leave this instant. Lila glanced at the crowd as if expecting someone to object, and when nobody did, her lips parted in shock. Silas offered his hand again, and he waited, because the first step into a new life is hers to take. Lila moved one finger, then another, till her small palm rested on his calloused skin, trembling still in plain sight. A murmur rose, not approval, not anger, just surprise, because the West rarely sees mercy chosen so openly by rich. Silas guided her down the steps, slow enough to match her, and I saw him soften without surrender in public. He didn't pat her head. He didn't speak sweet. He just kept hold like a steady post in windstorms. Lila kept her doll tucked close, and she walked beside him, feet light eyes scanning for traps every single step. Silas headed for the hitching rail where his wagon waited, plain and sturdy, not made for show at all today. A ranch hand of his, broad-shouldered and quiet, hurried over because he'd never seen this from his boss. Silas told the man fetch the purchases later, and the hand nodded, still staring at Lila's braids with uneasy wonder. I watched the crowd break apart because the spectacle was done and folks didn't know how to clap for kindness. Some men spat and some women crossed themselves and a few looked ashamed, which is a rare sight in markets. Silas lifted Lila into the wagon seat, careful with her ribs, and that care spoke louder than coin ever could. She sat stiff as a broom-handled doll on her lap, and she didn't look back at the yard once. Silas climbed up beside her, gathering the reins, and the leather creaked like it was waking too after long sleep. He clicked his tongue at the team, and the wagon rolled wheels, biting ruts, carrying them toward open grass northward. The town faded behind, and the prairie opened ahead, wide enough to hide a man or heal him if allowed. Lila finally spoke, the voice thin, and she asked, "Why did you do it? Why choose me out of all here?" Silas kept his eyes on the road, and he said, "Because I heard you tell the truth, and truth matters." He went on, "I've lived where nobody wanted my company, and I figured we might understand that pain real well." Lila studied him, and she didn't smile, yet her grip on the doll loosened like a knot easing under warmth. "I've seen that look before, the moment a starving soul tests a crust of bread and dares hope again slowly." Silas didn't promise forever. He didn't say pretty words. He just said, "You'll ride with me until we sort life." Lila asked, "Will you send me back?" And her voice cracked on back like that word was fire in winter. Silas answered, "I won't," and the shortness of it felt solid, like a rock set in mud to hold fast. He added, "I'll likely do this wrong, and if I do, we'll talk, not lash out at you ever again." That last word again slipped out because men like Silas repeat promises to make themselves believe them when fear rises. The wagon rolled on, and the wind lifted Lila's braid ends, and she didn't flinch this time at all now. Silas glanced at her, quick and careful, like checking a skittish horse, and he saw her breathing more evenly, too. He said, "We'll stop at my place, and you'll eat, because hunger has no schedule on my ranch from today," Lila whispered. "Okay." And that one word carried more courage than the whole crowd had shown her all damn day. Silas didn't smile, but his shoulders dropped as if the weight of choice had finally settled right into his bones. I stayed by that fence watching them shrink into distance, and I knew the town would talk for weeks afterward. They'd say a rich man bought trouble, and they'd miss the truth that trouble had already bought her in silence. Out here, the West sells myths, yet the real story is always simple, one hand reaching for another in dust. Lila had been taught she was extra, and Silas had been taught he was enough alone, both lies told often. That day on the boards, those lies met each other, and for 1 second, they cracked open like dry wood. I don't know what you believe, but I've learned a man isn't measured by cattle. He's measured by mercy shown. Silas showed it without preaching. And that's the only kind that lasts because it costs something real to keep going. As the wagon disappeared, the auctioneer gathered his papers, and I heard him mutter, "Well, I'll be wrong this time." He wasn't wrong, just late. Because the best parts of a story always start after the crowd quits watching close. Silas had a long road ahead, 10 miles of dust and doubt, and a child beside him counting risks quietly. He'd have to learn breakfast and braids and school books and the way fear hides behind manners in young faces. She'd have to learn that a man can keep a promise even when he doesn't know how to say love. I watched the last dust settle, and I thought about my own failures, the times I walked away too easy. Maybe you've done that too. Maybe you've seen someone standing alone, and you kept your hands busy so you couldn't. That's why this first chapter matters. Because it asks a hard question. What do you do next when you hear? Silas heard, and he moved, and the West shifted a hair because one lonely man chose to care for once. Lila didn't know it yet, but that handhold was a doorway, and the door swung both ways for 2 souls. So pour another cup, friend, and ride with me, because the next mile tells what mercy costs when winter comes. Silas Mercer didn't start cold. He started careful, like a boy taught early that smiles could be taken back by men who shook your hand in daylight then moved your fence posts at night and called it business for fun. His father, Amos Mercer, came west with railroad money, and a gambler's nerve bought grass that looked worthless and waited until drought broke weaker outfits, then bought their herds cheap without blinking once Silas watched, learning that mercy wasn't required. Amos built a house of stone and pine 2 stories tall with a wide porch facing the east pasture because he liked sunrise more than people, and he raised Silas to be the same. It worked until Love walked in. Her name was Clara Boone, and she taught the boy to laugh again by reading dime novels in the kitchen and by sneaking him hot biscuits when Amos was counting coins in town. Clara wasn't his mother, but she tried. Then fever came through the territory, and the kitchen went quiet, and Silas learned the first rule of the plains, that anything warm can go cold overnight, without warning, without apology, without reason, after he kept laughter on a leash. Amos called grief weakness, and he taught Silas to work it off. So the boy rode fence lines, fixed windmills, and branded calves until his hands looked older than his face at 16. He didn't complain because nobody listened anyway. When Silas turned 20, Amos put a ledger in his hands and said, "Cattle are numbers first and lives second. And if you forget that the land will take everything you love," son Silas believed belief was safer than a hope. The Mercer spread grew, and so did the distance between Silas and town, because Amos hated crowds and Silas hated small talk. And neither man ever learned how to ask for comfort. They built fences, then lived inside them alone. Still, a ranch needs more than iron. It needs hands, so Silas hired crews paid on time and kept the bunkhouse warm. Yet he never ate at their table, not even once. Closeness scared. So he kept it distant. At 27, he met a school teacher named May Harper in a supply store aisle, both reaching for lamp oil, and she smiled like she expected nothing from him, which made him curious. Curiosity is spark, and sparks burn fences. May talked plain, and she asked why a man with a full wagon always looked hungry, and Silas didn't have an answer, so he offered to drive her home once. On that ride, prairie was softer, and he noticed it. For a season, May visited the Mercer house, bringing books and laughter that didn't cost anything, and Silas tried to learn the habit of being looked at kindly without flinching away. He even fixed the lamp so it stayed lit. Amos didn't approve. He said women were storms, and storms take roofs, but Silas kept seeing May anyway because her presence made the big rooms feel less like a tomb. One night she held his hand, and he let her. Silas thought that was the start of a life, but May wanted warmth in return, and he only knew duty. So when she asked for promises, he offered plans, and she grew tired. She didn't leave angry. She left empty. The day she left, Amos said, "I told you," and Silas nodded because agreeing was easier than admitting he'd failed, and he rode out alone until the snow took sound. That silence became his hymn, and he sang it years. After Amos died, the ranch became Silas's outright, and folks expected him to marry to host dinners to act like a proper land baron. But he only hired another hand and worked. He slept with rifle by the bed habit. Silas's days turned into a machine sunrise coffee ledger, pages saddle leather, and miles of wire because machines don't mourn, and he wanted to be a machine, not a man. He kept the house clean but never filled it voices. He paid Mrs. Lynn, an older widow from a mining camp, to air out rooms and cook once a week, and even she learned not to ask about the locked trunk in his office. That trunk held letters and ring. Silas wrote contracts like scripture, and he expected the same honesty back, so when a neighbor tried to short him on calves, Silas took the man to court and won without smiling. After that, called him fair and feared him. He could have been loved if he'd wanted it, because money draws admirers like flies. Yet Silas could smell false sweetness, and it reminded him of fever breath in Clara's last days. So courtship stayed outside, and his latch stayed closed. By the time he was 35, the Mercer Ranch ran smooth, 1,500 head-clean books, good water rights, and a foreman who knew every draw. Yet Silas felt no pride, only relief. It kept surprises away and feelings. He took meals standing like a man ready to leave, and he kept one chair at the kitchen table because extra chairs invite stories, and stories invite questions, and questions invite in pain. At dusk he ledgers until the lamp died. Sometimes he rode the ridge alone, watching clouds build over the mountains. And he told himself that weather was honest. It showed you what it was, while people smiled, then changed. He trusted wind and he horses, and little else. In spring he worked calving season. Like a man in prayer, checking cows at midnight, pulling a weak calf free, then rubbing it dry because life starts messy, and he understood mess. What he didn't understand was how people stayed. When town folks invited him to socials, Silas always found an excuse: a broken gate, a sick horse, a water pump. Because gatherings felt like barns full of smoke hard to breathe in, he'd rather face storm than a question. Once a year he rode into town for supplies, and he kept his list folded in his shirt pocket because lists don't judge, and they don't ask why you're alone, and they don't pity coffee, nail, salt, and quiet it. He'd learned that the West forgives violence quicker than it forgives tenderness, so he kept his tenderness buried, and he let folks call him a hermit because names don't bruise you. But that day Lila's words bruised him clean through. He told himself it was none of his business, that other men had wives and soft hands, that other folks could raise children, and that he should drive home and count calves, not hearts. Yet his boots moved, mind agreed. Folks think wealth makes you fearless, but I've seen rich men tremble because money can't buy you a clean conscience. And Silas had been living with a dirty one for years. He'd walked past suffering and called it not his. The truth is, he didn't hate people. He feared what people could pull out of him, the soft parts, the hopeful parts, the parts that May Harper had touched, then left behind. He survived leaving, and he swore he wouldn't. When he stepped onto those auction boards, I saw a man fighting himself because one part wanted to run back to the list in his pocket, and one part wanted to answer a child he chose hard and surprised himself. On the ride out of town, his hands stayed steady on the reins, but inside he was rattling because he'd spent 5 years building a life that couldn't be changed by anyone, and now it was all from one sentence. He kept telling himself he wasn't a father and he wasn't a savior. He was just a man making a purchase, but the lie tasted sour because he'd already started caring right there. Caring is the rope, and it tightens. I heard him mutter once after May left that he'd rather break horses than break his own heart, and he meant it, because horses don't ask you to stay when you're scared. But Lila didn't ask either. She stated fact. A statement like that, spoken by a child, doesn't leave room for speeches. It leaves room only for action, and Silas Mercer, for all his ice, was a man of action. He fixed things he counted, and he chose life. Yet action has roots, and Silas's roots were tangled in loss, so even as he drove north, he watched the horizon like an enemy, expecting the good moment to end because it always had. Expectation was religion. It kept him. The Mercer Ranch looked rich from afar, but it was built on long nights, busted knuckles, and risk, and Silas remembered every hard decision. Every drought year, every calf that froze, every loan paid, money came comfort, never did once. He kept the ranch hands at arm's length, not from cruelty, but from fear, because if you learn a man's story, you might start to caring, and caring makes you slow when trouble rides. And Silas hated slow, he preferred edges. Even his kindness was measured. He'd buy boots for a boy with holes. Yet he'd leave them at the bunkhouse door anonymous because gratitude makes a man look at you, and he couldn't stand that eyes like hands could hurt. In his office, he kept maps pinned flat, and he marked springs and grazing rotations because land responds to planning. And planning responds to discipline, and discipline is easier than love every time love can't, and he didn't trust it. Some men carry a Bible. Silas carried a pocket watch, and he listened to it tick because time is honest. It moves forward no matter what, and it teaches you to expect leaving always. He rose at dawn, never slept. When a man lives alone, the house talks back floors, creak pipes, groan wind taps windows, and Silas answered that talk with more work because work drowns echoes better than whiskey does. He didn't drink, he needed his hands steady. The only time he felt anything close to peace was riding at dusk, watching cattle drift like dark boats on gold grass, hearing a hawk cry, and knowing no one expected him to speak. Speech is door it can slam. He'd built a reputation for fairness, and that mattered to him because fairness is control, and control is safety. Yet fairness didn't warm the bed, and it didn't fill the porch at night. So listened to coyotes and called company. After May Harper, he stopped keeping photos out, and he tucked everything into that trunk because memory is a spurred boot. It digs in when you least expect, and he hated surprises. He preferred storms. You could see debts count. That's why Lila's eyes mattered, because he recognized that same training, the way she stood still to avoid being noticed, the way she held pain behind her teeth, and the way hope stayed locked. He'd done that since Clara died. A man can ignore poverty, he can ignore gossip, he can ignore bad coffee, but he can't ignore himself. And Silas saw himself in that child standing on boards, pretending she didn't care. Pretending is work, and he tired working. He'd told himself for years that attachments were liabilities like bad pasture, like disease like wolves. Yet when Lila said nobody wanted her, he felt a liability turn into a duty. Sudden duty is familiar to Rancher. It gives direction. Still he feared the ridicule because towns like to punish any man who changes. They prefer you predictable, and Silas had been predictable, cold, distant, useful, and easy to label. Until now, he knew bets placed, and he hated losing. On his ranch, a mistake could mean a dead calf or a broken leg. So he kept mistakes rare, and that habit slid into his heart, making him avoid any choice that couldn't be reversed later. But Lila was choice. He'd always chosen things land cattle tools because things stay where you put them, but children are not things, and he knew that. Which is why the cash on the podium stung him. He paid because stopping would have been worse. Silas wasn't buying a helper. He was buying a chance to do one decent thing. And decency can feel strange to a man who's lived on pride, so he braced for regret quietly. Regret is bill that arrives after kindness. He expected Lila to test him, to run, to steal, to break something, because that's what scared children do. They poke the fence to see if it bites, and he respected that instinct. He'd poked fences when he was young. But respect doesn't teach you bedtime stories, and it doesn't teach you braids, and Silas knew he lacked those skills, so he planned to outsource what he couldn't do. Like any business, he hated thought, a child isn't a line. He remembered how Amos spoke about good stock, and he hated hearing that phrase used on Lila because kids aren't cattle. Yet the yard treated them like they were, and he'd stayed silent before silence made him rich and small. So when he took Lila's hand, he wasn't just taking a child. He was breaking a pattern, the pattern of walking past pain, and that break felt like stepping through ice expecting cold water. He didn't know he'd sink, stepped. And stepping is what he did best. He could step into a fight, into a blizzard, into a market crash, but stepping into fatherhood was different because the enemy wasn't outside. It was inside. Inside was grief, fear, love denied. Somewhere on that road north, he realized the ranch was no longer the main thing. The main thing was whether he could make a child feel safe, and that scared him more than wolves ever had. Fear means you care. He'd told Lila he didn't know how to be a father, and that was true, but he knew how to keep a gate latched and how to keep a promise, and he decided to start there. Start small, start steady. The next time you see him in your mind, don't picture a hero. Picture a tired man with dust on his cuffs counting nails in his pocket, then choosing to spend his last calm day on a child instead anyway. Because that's who Silas Mercer was, a man trained to manage risk, who finally took the only risk that mattered, the one that could break him, and the one that could save him too. A ranch rebuilds a child, doesn't. He'd been called cold, and maybe he was, but cold men still know hunger, and they know loneliness. And they know what it means when a room echoes back your own steps night after night. He didn't want Echo Lila, so he planned without saying it. School supplies, a proper mattress, a stove stocked for breakfast, and a woman's advice from someone like Mrs. Lynn, because he understood that pride is useless in childcare. Pride cost, he wouldn't repeat. He also knew the town would test him, because towns test anything unfamiliar. And a lone rancher raising a girl would invite sermons and whispers, so he'd have to show up, even when he hated it. Showing up is love. That's the part folks miss. They think love is flowers or sweet talk. But out here, love is chopping wood before dawn and driving through snow for medicine and standing between a child and cruelty. Silas could do that silent. He wasn't planning redemption. He was planning logistics, and sometimes logistics are the first step toward grace, because grace needs a place to land, a bed, a bowl, a lamp left on. He'd left lamps off for her, but not now. When he said he'd paid $50, he heard the ugliness in it, but he also heard the truth that the world makes you pay to fix what it breaks, and he was paying to fix one thing for once. He didn't know if the fix would hold, because children have storms inside them, and he had storms too, and storms can collide. But he'd rather weather that than return to empty rooms again. Empty rooms don't heal anew. So that's Silas Mercer before the story turned softer. A man who built an empire of grass and wire, then discovered that a child's whisper could reach deeper than any contract, deeper than any rifle. Deeper, it asked him human. And if you're wondering why he looked so hard when he stepped forward, it's because he wasn't hardening. He was holding himself together the same way a man grips reins in wind, steady, steady. He'd chosen hold on, not go. Lila Hart came from a brick city back east where smoke sat low and hunger walked the alleys like a stray dog, daily there too. Her mother stitched shirts for factory men and sang hymns soft at night until fever took her breath and left Lila listening alone afterward always. Her father kept books for a small store and tried to smile through bad luck until an iron machine crushed his hand, then hope entirely. Neighbors said they were respectable folk, but respectability doesn't buy coal. And when rent came due, the landlord turned mean fast that winter night too. Lila learned to fold herself small because small girls slip past trouble easier, and she carried that lesson west without knowing how heavy it was. At the orphan home, she slept high on a stacked bunk, and the ceiling felt close enough to press her thoughts flat each warm month. Rules ran that place like a whip, meals at set hours, prayers on command, and silence rewarded more than any kindness ever could offer her. When a child cried too loud, the matron's eyes went sharp, and Lila would stare at her doll, pretending courage for both of them then. The doll had been sewn from scrap cloth, and Lila named her Molly because names make things feel alive in dark rooms at times still. Molly's face wore smooth with thumb rubs, and that blank cloth taught Lila a hard truth, that some stories lose details when pain stays long. On placing days, the older girls fixed hair neat, and the smaller ones tried to look cute, but Lila only tried invisible to stay safe. She'd seen boys chosen quick for farms, and she'd seen babies lifted like prizes, and she'd seen herself passed over again and again by eyes. The matron called it opportunity, but Lila called it waiting, and waiting feels like standing on thin ice without boots under strangers' winter stares all. She practiced her manners like arithmetic. Yes, ma'am, no, sir, thank you, kindly, because politeness was armor she could wear when nothing else fit her right. Even so, she couldn't make her shoulders broader, and she couldn't make her eyes younger, and those things counted most to people shopping for children. When the train rolled west, Lila watched fields turn wide, and she thought the sky looked kinder, though she didn't trust it yet at all. A woman on the train gave her an apple slice, and Lila saved it in her pocket because gifts sometimes disappear if eaten too fast. She listened to the other children brag about new homes, and she kept quiet because bragging tempts the world to prove you wrong later anyway. By the time Montana dust found their clothes, Lila's shoes were thin, and she could feel each stone like it wanted a vote on her. At the yard, she smelled horses and fresh sawn boards, and she remembered her father's ink smell and missed it sudden in her throat today. They lined the children near the platform, and Lila counted her breaths because counting was the only control she still owned in that hour there. She watched couples whisper, and she watched farmers chew tobacco, and she watched a preacher's wife flinch at her thin arms as if poverty spread. The card said she could read, and that was true because books were the only place adults ever spoke gently to her without wanting something. She'd learned letters by candle stub tracing headlines left in scraps, and every word felt like a rung on a ladder out of that place. But ladders don't matter to folks who want labor, and Lila knew that. So she kept her reading quiet as prayer most days back then. When her turn came, she stepped up careful because splinters can draw blood, and she hated showing any weakness to a watching crowd outside herself. She held Molly tight, and she kept her chin level because a child who looks hopeful gets crushed harder when hope fails in public places. The auctioneer spoke her name, and his voice tried cheerful, but it sounded like rain on tin thin and helpless to anyone with ears open. He said she'd be good for household work, and Lila wondered what good meant because goodness never kept her warm when the coal ran out. A man in overalls studied her like a mule, and Lila lowered her gaze because meeting eyes invites questions she couldn't answer without feeling small. Inside her head, she rehearsed a new script. I'm quiet, I'm grateful, I won't eat much. Please don't send me away when you get tired. She hated that script, but it kept her alive, and alive was the first job she ever learned without help from any grown person nearby. Lila could read faces like weather. A soft smile meant pity. A tight smile meant fear, and a blank stare meant no chance today either. She saw blank stares stacked around her, and she felt her stomach hollow, not from hunger alone, but from being unseen by so many souls. That's when the word slipped out, not meant as a plea, just a fact, and her voice carried farther than she thought across dusty boards. No one wants me, she said, and the sentence landed heavy because every adult there had wanted something once too and remembered it quietly then. She expected the auctioneer to shoo her off, and she expected the crowd to turn away, and she prepared to feel nothing until the next. Then boots hit wood, and Lila heard the sound like thunder, and she didn't look up at first because hope hurts worse than hunger. Ever. When she finally raised her eyes, she saw Silas Mercer, tall and sun-worn, and his face held the same tired edge she'd seen inside. He didn't smile at her. And that felt safer because smiles can be traded, but a steady look costs something real from a hard man. Lila watched him place money down, and she knew money could be a chain, so she waited for the catch to show its teeth soon. When Silas said she'd come with him now, her heart kicked because the orphan home always delayed kindness until it faded into rule and cold. His hands stayed open, not grabbing, and Lila tested that openness because she'd learned touch could be a trap when you need help most badly. Her fingers were cold on his palm, and she hated that because cold hands tell secrets about a child's life to people who judge quick. Silas asked if she was scared, and Lila answered honest because lying had never saved her, only delayed pain by a few hours sometimes anyway. When she asked if he would hit her, she watched his eyes because eyes speak louder than promises, and she needed truth right there today. His no came quick and rough, and she believed the roughness more than any softness, because softness had fooled her before in other homes briefly. Still, she didn't relax fully because trusting is a slow muscle, and hers had been kept tied up for years under strict hands and rules. In the wagon, she sat straight and she counted fence posts because counting posts meant the road was real and moving away from that platform. She watched Silas's hands on the reins, and she noticed he didn't jerk them, and that gentleness surprised her like a bird finding grain unexpected. When wind blew hair across her mouth, she almost smiled because it felt like being a regular kid. Then she stopped before anyone could notice. She'd forgotten what regular felt like, and the forgetting made her angry because childhood shouldn't be something you misplace in a crowded dorm bed stack. Once back east, she'd chased a paper boat in gutter water, and she remembered laughing, and the memory hurt sweet like sugar on a bruise. She kept that boat memory tucked away, and she kept Molly close because small stories are the only property orphans own that cannot be stolen. Silas asked her about hunger, and she answered with rules because rules were simple and feelings were dangerous and messy in front of grown men. She told him meals had clocks, and he told her hunger had rights, and that idea sounded like a tall tale from a storybook. Yet she'd seen him pay extra for the orphan fund, and she'd seen him refuse delay, so maybe tales could walk into kitchens and bedrooms. Lila knew better than to ask for more, but she still listened because listening is how you find cracks and danger before it finds you. She studied Silas's coat cuffs, worn but clean, and she decided he wasn't careless, which mattered more than friendliness in a new house alone first. A careless man forgets soup, forgets blankets, forgets doors. and Lila couldn't survive another forgetting not after all those nights when cold pressed in tight. She watched the prairie roll by, and she tried to imagine a room that belonged to her, and she failed at first because ownership felt. In her mind, rooms always belong to rules, and rules belong to adults, and adults belong to themselves alone, not to kids like her ever. She wondered what Silas wanted in return, because every kindness she'd known carried a hook, even if it was hidden under smiles and church talk. The hook at the orphan home was obedience, and the hook on the train was gratitude, and the hook at yards was labor for life. Lila could work. She could scrub and she could sew. But she also wanted to draw, to paint horses and clouds and quiet pencil lines. She never said that want out loud because wanting extra makes you greedy, and greedy children get punished first in places where food is scarce. Still, when she saw a hawk circle, she tracked it with wonder, and that wonder was a small flame she hid behind her serious face. Silas noticed her watching the hawk, and he didn't laugh. He just said, "That one's hunting like we all do out here to get by." That line made sense to her, because she'd hunted for crumbs and for safe corners and for adults who didn't shout at night in anger. When the wagon bumped hard, she grabbed the seat and Silas slowed, saying, "Sorry," and nobody had said sorry to her for small hurts before. She didn't thank him, not yet, because thanks can sound like surrender, and she needed to keep a little power inside her thin ribs still. At the same time, she wanted to trust him, because a child can't live long without leaning somewhere even a little when storms come sudden. She asked about the ranch, and Silas answered plain, and his plainness felt real, like flour on hands, not speech made for sale in town. He said there were cattle fences and empty rooms, and Lila heard empty and wondered if empty could be kind instead of hungry like before. In the orphan dorm, empty meant nobody cared, but on that road, empty started to sound like space to breathe without elbows in her sides. She thought about breathing, and she tried one deep breath, and it tasted of sage, and that taste made her blink as if life was. She remembered her mother's sewing basket and how it smelled of thread and soap, and she wondered if Molly needed mending in this fresh country. She lifted the doll's loose arm, and she imagined a needle and strong twine, and that simple thought made her feel useful for something good. Useful was what adults praise, but she also wanted to be loved, and she didn't know how to ask for that without sounding weak again. She wondered if love was like bread baked regular or like candy handed out, once then gone, leaving craving behind and a dry mouth always. Silas offered her dried apples later, and she took one, and she chewed slow, because slow eating means nobody's rushing you to prove you belong. She almost asked if she could keep the apple bag because paper bags make good boats. Then she swallowed the thought and stayed serious again. That swallow was her habit, swallowing wants, swallowing fear, swallowing anger, till her throat felt tight like a knot, pulled by invisible hands each day. Sometimes she dreamed of her parents, not their faces, but their voices. And when she woke, Molly was the only anchor keeping her from floating. She feared the dream would fade, so she'd whisper their names, and whispers made her feel brave even when nobody heard in that crowded sleep. Now, beside Silas, the world felt less crowded, and that scared her too, because quiet leaves room for thoughts that run wild at midnight alone. Her thoughts asked, what if he changes? What if town folks convince him? What if she breaks a plate and loses everything over one mistake? She'd been taught mistakes were sins, and sins earned cold corners, so she planned to move like smoke, unseen and careful, until spring proved itself. But a child can't stay smoke forever, and Lila felt her own stubbornness, the same stubbornness that made her speak on boards when silence wrong. That stubborn streak had gotten her punished before, yet it also kept her alive, because it wouldn't let her disappear into the shadows forever again. She wondered if Silas needed her stubbornness, because he looked like a man who'd been holding his breath for years, waiting for reason to exhale. She didn't know she could be a reason, and that idea made her cheeks warm, because she'd only ever been a burden in people's ledgers. The wagon wheels creaked, and she listened to that steady sound, because steady sounds can lull fear like a song without words in a home. She watched Silas's profile, and she wondered if he'd ever been hungry as a child, because hunger recognizes hunger. Across years and across miles, too. She decided not to ask because questions can sound ungrateful, and she was still learning what questions were allowed in a life with choice inside. At the orphan home, asking why meant punishment, asking when meant scolding, asking for more meant laughter, so she asked little and learned to guess. Guessing kept her alive, guessing moods, guessing footsteps, guessing when to speak, and guessing when to vanish behind braids before a grown voice rose sharp. Now, as Silas, she tried a new kind of guessing what kindness looked like and whether it could last past one good afternoon ride. She pictured the big ranch house he mentioned, and she feared it would echo, because echoes make you feel watched by absence in every corner. Yet she also pictured a window with pasture beyond. And she liked that picture because open land feels like permission to grow without bumping walls. She imagined touching a horse's mane, and she smiled inside because horses don't care where you came from, only how you stand near their breath. The smile didn't reach her mouth, but it softened her eyes, and Silas noticed, and he didn't tease her for it like some men might. Instead, he said, "We'll get you a proper coat before snow," and Lila heard planning, and planning sounded like staying through seasons, not just days. Staying was a word she'd barely used because nothing stayed in her world, not parents, not bread, not comfort, not pride once it touched her. As the prairie road bent north, Lila held Molly up to the light, and she swore she'd keep her new story stitched with both hands. She didn't know what tomorrow would demand, but she knew this man had heard her, and she was still here, breathing air beside him. Silas showed her the pantry, and she saw it stocked well. Flour sat in sacks, and beans waited in jars nearby. Lila asked, "Is it always this full, Silas?" Silas said, "It will be if I can help." She nodded again and tucked Molly closer to her ribs. Silas pointed to the stove and explained its iron temper. He said, "It's hot, quick, so mind your sleeves, kid." Lila listened close and memorized warnings like scripture tonight. Silas set a kettle on and watched steam rise slowly. He asked, "Do you like tea or milk better?" Lila said, "Milk is for sick kids, not like me." Silas replied, "Milk is for warm kids, and that's you." Lila blinked hard and turned toward the window again briefly. Outside the corral, horses shifted, and leather creaked softly there. Silas said, "Tomorrow you'll meet Dove. She's gentle enough," Lila whispered. "I've never touched a horse, Silas." Silas answered, "Then tomorrow you will, if you want." That "if you want" landed heavy, and Lila breathed shallow. She asked, "What if I don't want? Will you be mad?" Silas said, "No, we'll go slow like spring thaw." He cleared plates, and Lila reached to help without asking. Silas stopped her gently and said, "Finish eating first, kid." Lila obeyed, yet her hands still shook above crumbs. Silas saw those tremors, and he hated whoever taught them. He said, "You're safe here, even when you spill." Lila asked, "Even when I break something?" Silas replied, "We'll fix it, and you won't be punished." Lila whispered, "Punished for being human, like you said before." Silas nodded once, and his eyes looked far away. He said, "I know cruelty, and I won't copy it." Lila stared at his hands and saw old scars there. She asked, "Did someone hurt you too?" Silas answered, "Life did, and I let it happen." Lila thought on that, and her mouth tightened with worry. Silas changed the subject and asked about Molly's loose arm. Lila lifted the doll and showed the thread hanging free. Silas said, "We'll mend her tomorrow with needle and twine." Lila's eyes softened, and she nodded like that mattered. Silas said, "It does matter. Small things hold big hearts." Evening settled outside, and shadows stretched across the hallway, quiet. Silas led Lila to her room, carrying a lamp steady. He set it on the dresser and checked the wick twice. Lila asked, "Why leave it? I can sleep dark." Silas said, "You won't have to not hear anymore." Lila swallowed hard, and her fingers tapped the mattress frame. Silas said, "I'll bring blankets now, then you can rest." Lila said, "I don't need much, Silas, truly." Silas replied, "You'll get enough even if you protest." He returned with quilts, and the smell of cedar followed. Lila touched the cloth, and her breath caught, surprised. Silas said, "They're clean, and they're yours all years." Lila asked, "What if you change your mind tomorrow?" Silas. Silas answered, I won't send you back. That's settled. He hesitated there and added, I'm clumsy at comfort. Lila said, comfort is strange. I don't know the rules. Silas replied, new rule is simple. You tell truth here. Lila nodded once and her shoulders eased a little. Silas stepped to the door and paused with hand hovering. He asked, do you want it closed or cracked tonight? Lila thought hard and she said, cracked. Please, Silas. Silas said, cracked it is, and he respected her choice. He walked away slowly and the hallway creaked like warning. Lila sat on the bed frame and listened to house sounds. She heard no yelling, and that silence felt unfamiliar tonight. Downstairs, Silas moved dishes, and coffee smell lingered faintly. Lila hugged Molly and whispered, we're still here, Molly. She lay down carefully and stared at the ceiling long. Her mind waited for punishment, but none arrived in darkness. Silas in his room sat and rubbed tired eyes. He told himself, she's fed, she's warm, that's start. Yet his chest felt tight, and he hated that feeling. He'd trained himself for emptiness, and now emptiness was gone. He heard a floorboard creak, and he froze in place. Silas listened again and heard nothing but wind outside. He stood anyway and walked toward the kitchen with caution. Coffee was habit, he thought, and habit keeps panic down. He struck a match and lit the lamp with care. Moonlight lay silver, and the kitchen looked like church quiet. Silas poured water, and the kettle began its low song. Then soft steps came down, and Silas turned slowly. Lila stood in the doorway, and her eyes were red. Silas asked, can't sleep, kid, and kept voice gentle. Lila shook her head and clutched Molly like armor tight. Silas said me neither and pulled out a chair. Lila sat stiffly and watched his hands with caution still. Silas poured milk and set the pot on stove. He said warm helps, and he stirred with a spoon. Lila asked, am I trouble being awake like this? Silas replied, you're not trouble, you're just awake tonight. Lila whispered awake is dangerous at the home it was. Silas frowned hard and kept stirring so anger stayed down. He asked what happens there when kids can't sleep. Lila said they say hush, and they lock doors sometimes. Silas said no locked doors here, not for sleep. Lila watched steam rise and her breathing slowed a bit. Silas asked what keeps you up besides new rooms. Lila said, I think it's not real, it's dream. Silas answered, dreams don't smell like coffee or creak boards. Lila asked, how do you know, Silas? Truly, Silas said, because you're hurting and pain means it's real. Lila stared at the table and a tear fell silently. Silas didn't reach fast, and that restraint felt respectful. He set the cup down and slid it toward her. Lila wrapped hands around it, and warmth softened her face. Silas said, you can cry here if you want. Lila whispered, crying makes people mad, makes them leave quickly. Silas replied, I'm not leaving, not over tears ever. Lila asked, do you promise, Silas? Even if it's messy, Silas said, I promise, and his voice sounded like gravel. Lila drank slowly, and milk left a white mustache there. Silas almost smiled, and then he let the smile stay. Lila noticed it, and her own mouth twitched faintly too. Silas said, we're both learning, and that's allowed here. Lila asked, why do you live alone in so much house? Silas answered, because alone felt safer after I lost someone. Lila said, losing makes holes, and holes echo at night. Silas nodded once and looked at the dark window quietly. He said, you talk older than 8, and I'm sorry, Lila replied. Kids who stay young don't last as well. Silas swallowed hard, and the spoon stopped in his hand. He said, you don't have to survive here, you get live. Lila asked, is living different or just prettier words? Silas answered, maybe different, if someone stays beside you. Lila held Molly up and said, Molly can't stay, really. Silas said, people can if they choose and keep choosing. Lila asked, will you choose tomorrow when morning feels harder? Silas replied, yes, tomorrow too, and the next day. Lila asked, what if I'm bad or broken or too much? Silas said, then we'll see it and we'll mend it. Lila said, nobody mends kids, they throw them away. Instead, Silas answered, that's a lie, and I'm done with lies. Lila watched him closely, and her eyes finally blinked slow. Silas asked, do you feel safe right now in here? Lila considered long and said, safer than I remember. Yes. Silas nodded once, and relief crossed his face quietly there. He said, "Finish the milk, then I'll walk you back." Lila drank the last and set the cup down carefully. Silas stood and offered his hand again, palm up. Lila took it this time, and her grip felt steadier. They walked the hallway together, and the house seemed softer now. At her door, Silas paused and spoke one last rule. He said, "If fear wakes you, you come find me," Lila asked, "even if it's midnight, even if you're tired." Silas replied, "Especially then, because fear hates company most." Lila nodded once, and that nod looked like trust starting. Silas set the lamp low and kept the door cracked. Lila lay down under quilts, and Molly rested beneath chin. Silas said, "One day at a time, kid will." Lila whispered, "One day at a time, Silas." "Okay." Silas walked back to his room and sat on bed. He listened to her breathing, and the rhythm eased his chest. For years he'd feared attachment, and now he feared losing. He admitted quietly, "It's better than silence," and meant it. Outside the wind rose, and inside the lamp stayed warm. Lila closed her eyes, and sleep came like gentle rain. Silas stayed awake a while and thanked God without words. He'd promised 3 simple things, and he'd start keeping them. Morning came crisp, and Silas found Lila on the landing step, watching light spill across pasture like she was learning mornings could belong too now. He brewed coffee, then set a pan for eggs, and she watched his hands, studying each motion, the way hungry kids study rules closely always. Silas showed her how to crack a shell, and she flinched at the sound, then relaxed when nothing bad followed that small mistake today either. She tried again slower, and the yolk slid clean, and Silas said, "That was fine work, even if the edges looked rough to him anyway." Lila ate at the table, not standing, and she kept Molly beside her plate, as if the doll deserved breakfast too right here with her. Silas pretended the meal was ordinary, but he kept counting her bites, and every careful chew told him about years he couldn't undo at all. After dishes, he saddled Flint, and he brought out a small mare named Juniper, who blinked patient eyes at Lila's shaking hands this bright morning. He lifted her up gentle, and he adjusted stirrups for short legs. Then he said, "Hold the rein soft, firm, and breathe slow like that." They rode a short circle by the corral, and Lila's grip eased because Juniper moved like she promised safety to every child once before, too. Silas pointed at fences and water troughs, and he talked about simple things, because simple words are how scared hearts start listening again out here. By late morning, wagon wheels sounded on the drive, and Silas felt his shoulders tighten because visitors meant questions he didn't control most days anymore. Mrs. Lynn stepped down with a crate of vegetables, and she looked at Silas like he'd dragged home a problem he couldn't fix alone, ever. Then her gaze slid to Lila, and it softened, though her mouth stayed stern, like a woman saving tenderness for the right moment only once. She took Lila's wrist, not rough, and she frowned at the thin bones. Then she said, "You're too skinny, child. We fix that starting now." Lila answered, "Yes, ma'am," because old habits cling. And Silas hated hearing obedience sound like fear, yet Mrs. Lynn just nodded slow and certain there. She turned on Silas, and she said, "You've been living on coffee and jerky, haven't you? Don't lie. I can see it in your face." Silas muttered, "Yes, ma'am," and the ranch hands grinned outside because nobody outranked their boss except a woman who fed him on cold mornings, too. Mrs. Lynn carried in fabric needles and a jar of salve, and she announced she'd make proper dresses and mend that doll before supper time. Lila looked up surprised, and she asked, "You can fix Molly's arm," and Mrs. Lynn said, "Of course I've fixed worse with less thread, too." Silas watched Lila smile, small and real, and it struck him hard that he'd never once made that smile happen alone in his empty house. Mrs. Lynn shooed him toward the yard, saying, "Go work, I'll handle kitchen, because children need women's sense as much as men's today and tomorrow." Silas stepped outside, feeling oddly dismissed, and he realized he didn't mind because dismissal meant someone else had taken the wheel a while for his sake. Tommy Rourke, his foreman, leaned on the fence and said, "Boss Town's already yapping. They can't picture you with a girl in that big place." Silas asked, "What are the bets?" And Tommy said, 3-1. You send her back quick because folks love losing faith in men like that. Silas replied, "Let them talk," and Tommy nodded, then said, "You'll need allies because she'll face that talk at school too soon enough in town." Inside, Mrs. Lynn had Lila sit at the table, and she measured shoulders with twine, talking steady, like sewing was prayer in her own way. Lila answered questions about size and shoes, and she kept glancing toward the door, still expecting Silas to change his mind before stitches could hold. Mrs. Lynn saw that glance, and she said, "Plain he's stubborn child. When he chooses a thing, it stays chosen until the world breaks first," Lila whispered. "The world breaks first a lot," and Mrs. Lynn replied, "Yes. So we reinforce, we sow strong, we feed strong, and we stand." She set a pot of chicken stew, and the smell-filled rooms Silas had left hollow, and those rooms seemed to breathe again at last. While the stew simmered, Mrs. Lynn stitched Molly's arm, and Lila watched the needle rise and fall like a heartbeat. She trusted more each minute. When the arm held firm, Lila pressed the doll to her cheek, and she whispered, "Thank you," and Mrs. Lynn said, "You're welcome, little miss." That little miss made Lila flush because nobody had called her anything sweet without wanting payment, and Silas heard it from the hall just then. He leaned on the door frame, and Mrs. Lynn looked at him, then said, "Don't hover. You'll scare her. Go fix fences like you always." Silas obeyed, but he paused long enough to say, "You're doing good, Lila," and she answered with a nod that tried not to hope yet. In the yard, Tommy asked if Mrs. Lynn would stay, and Silas said, "She will as long as her temper doesn't run me off first." Tommy laughed, then said her temper's saved this ranch before, and Silas couldn't deny it, because she'd shamed him into eating proper meals for years. That afternoon, Lila followed Mrs. Lynn around the kitchen, learning where spoons lived and how to wash cups without rushing fear out of her hands. Mrs. Lynn didn't demand perfection. She demanded effort, and she corrected gentle but firm, like a fence post set straight before winter storms arrive hard. When Lila dropped a plate, it didn't break, but she froze, expecting anger, and Mrs. Lynn said, "Pick it up, no drama, we keep moving." Lila swallowed a sob, and she whispered, "I'm sorry," and Mrs. Lynn answered, "Save sorry for harm, this is just living in a real house." Silas heard that, and something unclenched inside him, because he'd never called his own house real until a child lived there with laughter beginning too. Supper came early, stew and biscuits, and Mrs. Lynn made Silas sit, not roam. Then she filled Lila's bowl twice without asking permission. Once more, Lila ate slow at first, then quicker, and Silas looked away to give her dignity while Mrs. Lynn kept talking about weather and garden plans. After supper, Mrs. Lynn pulled out scraps, and she taught Lila a simple seam. Then she praised the girl's tiny stitches for being neat today. Lila said she'd sewn Molly's dress at the home, and Mrs. Lynn said that means you've got hands, and hands make futures when you're ready. Silas sat with coffee listening to their voices, and the sound felt strange, like a door in his chest swinging on rusty hinges at dusk. Mrs. Lynn noticed his stare, and she said, "Don't look shocked. A house is meant for talk, not just boots and ledgers all night long." Silas grunted, and Lila asked, "What's a ledger?" And he explained numbers. Then Mrs. Lynn said numbers won't tuck a girl in when fear wakes. Lila stared at her wide-eyed, and Mrs. Lynn softened again, saying, "Don't fret, he'll learn, and I'll teach him until you both can breathe." That night, Silas found a battered storybook in his trunk, and he brought it out because he remembered Clara reading by a lamp as a boy. Lila perched on the chair arm close but not touching, and Silas read slow, letting each word settle like dust after hooves on dry roads. Mrs. Lynn hummed while she folded fabric, and the hum carried comfort, not the sharp peams of the home, but something earned in long living. Lila's eyelids drooped, and her head leaned against Silas's shoulder, and he went still afraid to break that fragile trust with one clumsy move tonight. He carried her upstairs careful as carrying a glass lamp, and he set her under quilts, then left the hallway lamp low for her sake. Mrs. Lynn watched from the doorway, and she whispered, "He's got it in him, even if he don't know," and Silas heard every word clear. Silas answered in a low voice, "I'm not built for this," and Mrs. Lynn said nobody's built, they're made day by choosing again. In the days that followed, Mrs. Lynn came each morning, and the kitchen filled with steam, and Lila's laughter showed up careful like a fawn. Silas returned from fence work, and he found Lila kneading dough flour on her nose, and He felt something like pride in his quiet chest. Lila held up Molly, now mended, and she said she's whole, and Mrs. Lynn said so are you if you let folks help you heal. Silas watched Lila think on that, and he knew the same lesson applied to him, though he'd spent years refusing stitches for old wounds too. Mrs. Lynn kept his coffee cup filled, but she also kept his pride in check, and she reminded him to buy books for school soon. One afternoon, she sent Silas into town with a list longer than his patience, and she said a child needs more than boots and beef. Silas grumbled, yet he went because Mrs. Lynn was right, and he was learning that listening is part of keeping promises when love is new. When he returned, Lila met him at the porch, and she asked if he'd come back like it wasn't certain, and he hated that fear. Mrs. Lynn stepped out behind her, and she said, "Don't tease the girl, show the parcels." Then she winked at Silas to soften him up. Lila opened a slate board, chalk, and a wool coat, and she touched each thing like it might vanish until Mrs. Lynn tapped her hand. She said, "Keep it, it's yours." And Lila swallowed, then whispered mine, and Silas turned away so she wouldn't see his eyes get too wet. That evening, Mrs. Lynn spoke to Silas, plain saying you can't hide forever because the town will judge her by you whether you like it. Silas said, "I don't care what they think," and Mrs. Lynn replied, "You should, because she's the one who walks their streets each day alone." Silas sat on the porch later, and Lila leaned beside him, and she asked if Mrs. Lynn would always come back tomorrow to teach me. Silas answered, "She will, and I will too," and Lila nodded, then said, "I'm trying to believe that Silas truly, even when fear shouts loud." Mrs. Lynn's wagon left at dusk, but her warmth stayed in stew smell and mended thread and in the way Silas breathed easier all night. For the first time in years, Silas noticed how empty rooms looked, and he began planning curtains, a mattress, and a school shelf for her. Lila climbed into bed holding Molly, and she whispered good night to the house because the house had finally started answering back with quiet kindness to it. Silas sat at his desk, and he wrote down 3 rules again: warm, bed full, belly safe hands, as if ink could help him remember. He heard Lila laugh once in her sleep, a tiny sound, and he felt gratitude because laughter means a child dared to relax at last. Out on the prairie, coyotes called, and Silas listened. Yet the calls didn't sound like loneliness anymore. They sounded like outside, where it belongs now. Next morning, Mrs. Lynn returned with apples and soap, and she told Lila to wash hands. Then she laughed at the girl's frown, so serious. Lila said soap stings, and Mrs. Lynn said that sting means clean, and clean means you're cared for, so bear it like a brave one. Silas tried to thank Mrs. Lynn, and she waved it off, saying, "Thank me by staying steady because a girl's trust is shy as spring." Lila practiced reading aloud, and when she stumbled, Mrs. Lynn corrected, not scolding, and Silas heard the difference, like rain after drought on baked ground. Mrs. Lynn asked Silas if he owned a mirror upstairs, and he said why. Then she told him to look. "You're smiling now." "Don't deny." Silas muttered, "It's nothing," and Mrs. Lynn replied, "It's something it means. Your heart's thawing, and thaw makes mud before grass comes back strong again." Lila overheard, and she asked, "What's thaw?" And Silas explained winter loosens, and she said, "I'd like my winter to loosen some day soon, if possible." Mrs. Lynn set a hand on her shoulder, and she said, "It will, child, but you don't force it. You warm it slow with safe days." That afternoon, Silas brought home a small ribbon, and Lila braided it into her hair. Then she kept touching it, like proof she belonged here. Mrs. Lynn said pretty, and Lila blushed, because praise felt dangerous, yet she didn't shrink away, and Silas noticed that too, with quiet relief today. At supper, Tommy stopped by, and Mrs. Lynn fed him stew. Then she told him, "Keep your opinions kind around the girl, or I'll hear." Tommy raised his hands and promised, and Lila smiled at that, because protection from someone other than Silas felt like a new wall against storms. Silas realized then that a child needs a circle, not a single post, and he began to accept help without shame from good people nearby. Mrs. Lynn taught Lila to peel apples, and she said, "Keep the knife slow because haste cuts, and we've had enough cuts in our lives." Lila asked if Silas had cuts, and Mrs. Lynn said yes, but he hides them under work, and that's why you're here to change that. Silas pretended not to hear, but he did, and his throat tightened because the truth is hard when it's spoken kindly in plain daylight, too. That night, Lila asked for a story again, and Silas read. Then Mrs. Lynn corrected his pronunciation, laughing like family should around a warm lamp. Lila laughed too, a quick, bright sound, and Silas felt his house turn less like a fortress, more like a place to come home to. Mrs. Lynn packed up to leave, and Lila asked, "Will you return?" And she said, "I return, unless you stop eating or stop trying both." Silas promised he'd try, and Mrs. Lynn nodded. Then she told him, "Keep the porch lamp lit. Kids fear dark memories more than dark rooms." Later, Silas checked the lamp, and he added oil, because that was a task he understood, and understanding can be a bridge toward bigger promises. Lila stood beside him, and she said, "Thank you for the light," and Silas said, "You don't have to thank me for safety ever again." She looked confused. Then she whispered, "I still will," and Silas felt tears pressed behind his eyes because gratitude is heavy for men like him. Mrs. Lynn's visits became rhythm, and rhythm became comfort, and comfort became courage, the kind that lets a child ask for seconds without flinching first. One morning, Lila asked for a second biscuit, and Silas froze, then smiled, and Mrs. Lynn said, "See, she's trusting her hunger won't be punished." Silas took a biscuit, too, and he ate beside her, because sharing food is sharing life, and he was done eating alone in that house. Tommy noticed, and he said, "Boss, you're changing," and Silas answered, "Maybe." And Tommy said, "Good change beats dying slow in quiet rooms every night." Lila heard that, and she asked, "Am I changed?" And Silas said, "You're a person," and Mrs. Lynn said amen to that, plain and simple. Mrs. Lynn started teaching Lila songs while they worked, not church songs, just small tunes, and Silas felt Clara's memory soften instead of stabbing him. He told Mrs. Lynn about Clara one evening, and she listened without pity. Then she said, "You honor her by feeding this girl with steadiness." Lila overheard from the stairs, and she hugged Molly because being honored sounded like being wanted, and wanted was new to her small soul, too. Silas began leaving his office door open, and Lila wandered in to draw horses, and he praised her not too much, just enough to stay. Mrs. Lynn said praise is like salt. Use it right, and it saves a meal used too much, and it ruins what could have grown. Silas asked how she learned that, and Mrs. Lynn said by raising sons through hard winters and by burying a husband early in her bones. Lila looked at Mrs. Lynn with respect, and she said, "You're brave." And Mrs. Lynn replied, "Brave is cooking when you're tired and showing up." Silas watched them together, and he understood at last that this ranch needed more than cattle. It needed women's wisdom and laughter to stay alive. Saturday came with a dry wind, and Silas hitched the wagon early because Lila needed school papers, new shoes, and a town that could see her standing beside him. He'd rather face a blizzard than gossip, but he'd promised she wouldn't hide, and promises don't care about a man's comfort. Main Street watched them roll in, and every porch chair turned into a judge's bench as women paused mid-shopping and men pretended to study harness leather, while their eyes tracked the girl in calico. Lila kept her chin up, yet her fingers worried Molly's seams, and Silas listened hard. At Hensley Mercantile, the clerk greeted Silas polite, but his smile stayed thin, and when Lila asked for slate chalk, he spoke over her head as if a child without family name shouldn't take up air. Silas bought the supplies anyway, laying coins down steady, and Lila watched learning quietly. Miss Crowley stood in the schoolhouse doorway, gray hair pinned tight, and she looked Lila up and down like she'd found a burr on her skirt, then told Silas the girl would sit in back until she proved herself. Silas said she can read, and Crowley answered, "We'll see Mercer." On the ride home, Lila stared at her hands, and Silas kept the reins straight because anger was crowding his chest. Yet he didn't want his anger to become another thing the town used to shame her. She whispered, "They're already looking like I'm a problem," and he swallowed hard. Monday morning arrived sharp, and Lila wore the blue dress Mrs. Lynn stitched, braids neat, lunch pail clean, and fear tucked under her ribs, while Silas watched from the porch, wishing he could ride inside her pocket. He said, "You're as good as any of them," then helped her down. The schoolyard quieted when she stepped through the gate, and kids in caps and pinafores stopped their chatter as if her shoes carried dust from the orphan home. and that dust might stain their games, their mother's pride, their names. Lila walked on, breathing, because numbers kept her legs steady. Inside, Miss Crowley pointed her to the back bench near two boys who stared at the floor, and Lila set her slate down careful, then raised her hand twice, and each time Crowley looked past her like she was smoke. The lesson marched on, and Lila learned daylight ignored you. At noon, she carried her pail outside, and she chose the cottonwood farthest from the noise because distance felt safer than begging for a spot, and she ate her sandwich in small bites, watching other kids trade sweets and secrets. Two girls giggled, pointing at Molly and Lila, chewing anyway. After the bell, a pair of boys followed her to the fence line, and they tossed small stones not to break bones, but to prove she was fair target, and one pebble caught her forearm, leaving a purple mark she hid fast. She didn't cry, went still, then walked home. Silas waited by the wagon at 3, pretending to study the harness, but his eyes never left the door. And when Lila finally appeared alone and tight-faced, he knew the day had been rough before she spoke. She climbed up, said it was fine, and he didn't believe her. Out past the last storefront, Lila told him what they called her, and her voice stayed flat, and when she showed the bruise, Silas's hands tightened on the reins. Then he turned the team back toward town, seeing red. She grabbed his sleeve. "Please don't. It'll follow me forever, Silas." Silas stopped in the road, and he faced her because he wanted to charge in. Yet he saw her fear wasn't of the boys. It was of being marked as helpless. So he asked what she needed right now, not later. She said, "Let me stand and you stand ready." She called him her father without meaning to, and the word landed between them heavy as a saddle because Silas had been dodging that shape of love. Yet it sounded right in her mouth like a name she'd been owed. He didn't correct her, just nodded and promised. Again, steady, Mrs. Lynn met them at the door, and she read Lila's face like a weather map, then set cookies and tea on the table because comfort is a kind of medicine. And she didn't ask permission to give it, she just did. Silas watched, learning how women soothe without speeches. While Lila nibbled, Mrs. Lynn told her, "Different isn't bad, it's just different." And she said, "Brave girls start over even when mean folks call them names." And Lila listened like she'd never been offered that angle before in life. Silas stayed in the doorway, guarding her pride, not body. Outside, Tommy Rourke rolled a cigarette, and he warned Silas that town opinion could make Lila's school days hell because folks already thought Mercer blood was cold, and a cold man's charity looks suspicious even when it's real and stubborn. He said, "Show up. Let them see you two together." Silas muttered that he hated socials, hated church halls, hated smiling at people who'd never lifted a fence post yet. Tommy answered, "Hate it later, boss, because she needs allies now, and you are the first ally she's ever had." That landed hard, and Silas nodded because truth hurts men. The week settled into a hard pattern. Lila went to school with her spine straight, came home with quiet eyes, and did her sums by lamplight, while Silas fixed tacking fences, hearing her muffled sniffles at night and saying nothing. He waited for cue because help should be invited. By Friday evening, Silas found her at the desk, slate covered in careful numbers, and he saw how tired courage looked on a child's face. So he said, "They're having a harvest social tomorrow, and we're going because hiding isn't working anymore." Lila blinked, whispered, "Will they stare again, Silas?" Mrs. Lynn clapped her hands when she heard the plan, and she pulled the green dress from her sewing chest, smoothing the lace collar, while Silas grumbled about halls and hymns, and Lila stood in the doorway, scared and pleased at once. Lynn said, "You'll go eat pie and behave." The church hall was bright with bunting, and it smelled of cider and baked apples. Yet when Silas and Lila stepped inside, the room dipped quiet, and Lila's hand slid into his, tight as a knot, asking without words. He squeezed once and whispered, "Courage, kid. We're just standing here." Margaret Hale, round-faced and quick-witted, swept toward them like a rescue wagon, and she welcomed Lila first, not Silas, which mattered. Then she shoved warm cider into Silas's hand and began introductions before gossip could bite. Lila stayed close, listening to names, letting herself be seen carefully tonight. Near the dessert table, 3 girls from school drifted in their ribbons, bright and their smiles sharp, and Silas started forward, but Margaret caught his sleeve, saying, "Let her speak, because she can't learn strength if you swing your shadow every time." Silas swallowed, stayed put, though his jaw hard. Catherine Vale, the preacher's daughter, looked Lila up and down and said, "Nice dress did the charity ladies pick it?" And Lila answered calm, "Mrs. Lynn made it. She's the best seamstress around." Then Catherine wrinkled her nose at that. Another girl muttered about Lynn, and Lila's eyes sharpened bright. Lila said, "My father says it's improper to be cruel," and Catherine flushed, then tried again. "At least my mother is alive, and at least I've got real family, not some lonely rancher who bought you." And Silas felt the room tighten. Lila flinched, yet she held steady voice true. Lila said, "You're right. My parents died, and it hurt more than you know. But I've got family now, because Silas chose me when nobody else would, and being chosen is better than being raised to laugh at a hurting kid." The girls went silent, and adults nearby stopped chewing. Catherine's mouth opened, then shut, and she turned away, fast, dragging her friends, and Lila's hands shook on the dessert plate. But she didn't drop it, and when Silas finally reached her, he said, "You did fine, kid." She asked, "Was I too mean?" And he said, "You were honest." Outside on the church steps, cold air cooled her cheeks, and Lila whispered. She hated proving herself, hated used-up pity, hated that folks saw what she lacked, not what she was. And Silas answered, "I know, but you showed them who you are. Some learned, some won't. That's life." Back inside, the social carried on, yet the whispers had changed tone because people had heard a small girl speak with steel, and they'd watched Silas stand behind her, not barking, not boasting, just present, and presence makes gossip nervous. Margaret handed Lila pie, and Lila ate it like proof. On the drive home, stars came out, and Lila leaned drowsy against the seat, and she whispered, "Thank you for choosing me," and Silas replied, "You don't owe me gratitude for being a person," but he felt grateful anyway, finding her. He said, "Inside, it's cold. Lynn will scold me." Monday morning brought an official envelope, and the courier waited for Silas's signature. And when Silas read the petition challenging his guardianship, his blood went cold because the town had turned its gossip into law, and law can steal quietly. Lila saw his face and asked, "What's wrong?" Voice brittle. He folded the letter and forced his voice steady, telling Lila, "Someone's trying to take you away." And her face drained pale because she knew good things vanish. Yet Silas set his jaw, saying, "They can try, but they won't win. Not easy." Mrs. Lynn heard, and eyes went hard. Lila whispered, "Can they really do it?" And Silas wanted to lie sweet, but he chose truth, saying, "They can try, and that's why we'll fight smart." And he added, "Demonstrate. Not just swear that you're safer here than anywhere else." She nodded, held Molly like stitching could stop law. Silas saddled Flint before noon, and he told Lila she'd stay with Mrs. Lynn because town talk was sharp enough, without dragging her into lawyer offices. And Lila tried to be brave, but her voice cracked, asking, "You'll come back, right?" He said, "I'll come back, kid. That's the point." As he rode, Silas replayed the schoolyard, the stones, the back bench, the way Crowley ignored a raised hand, and he finally admitted Tommy was right, that his own distance had given folks room to paint Lila as a stray, not kin. He swore he'd step in town and stay. He found Attorney Miles Hawthorne above the mercantile, a man with ink-stained fingers, and Silas dropped the petition on his desk, saying, "I need you and Hawthorne." Read it slow, then asked, "Why'd you take her? Tell me plain." Silas said, "She said nobody wanted her." Then I listened. Hawthorne tapped the paper and warned judges like community proof, not just money. So he told Silas to gather schoolwork letters and neighbors who'd speak without paycheck, and Silas felt the cost of his own isolation because he hadn't made friends. He left the office knowing the fight had begun. When Silas rode back, Lila stood on the porch with the shawl Mrs. Lynn wrapped around her, and she searched his face for news like a starving kid searches a plate. And Silas said, "We got work to do, but you're staying with me." She exhaled hard, then nodded brave. Even with fear in her belly, Lila went back to school the next morning because she refused to give Crowley the satisfaction of seeing her hide, and Silas drove her himself, parking where she could see the wagon, a quiet promise made of wood and wheels. She nodded, walked in, In the classroom, whispers followed her, but a few heads turned with something new. Not kindness, yet more like curiosity, because they'd heard about the social, and kids can smell a shift in power, so the laughter softened by a notch today. Crowley watched, and Lila raised her hand steady. At lunch, the Morrison boy, whose wagon ride in the storm had become town talk, sat near Lila under the cottonwood, not saying much, just sharing an apple slice, and that small act drew 2 more kids because bravery is contagious when it's quiet. Lila smiled, then looked down embarrassed. That afternoon, Lila climbed into the wagon with no new bruise to show, and Silas didn't ask too many questions because he didn't want to turn her life into a report. Yet he noticed her shoulders weren't as tight, and he felt relief like rain. She said kid shared lunch. That night, Silas told Tommy Rourke about the petition, and Tommy's face tightened because he'd seen courts before, and he said, "You'll need the town to see her as ours, not yours. So start showing up at meetings even when you'd rather chew nails." Silas nodded because he knew it. Mrs. Lynn rode into town the next day, and she came back with 3 women from the Ladies' Aid, all of them plain-dressed and sharp-eyed, and they said they'd sign letters, teach Lila Sunda, and stand in court if needed, because some women remember being judged unfairly before. Lila sat at the table listening to those women speak her name like it mattered, and she didn't quite trust it, yet her eyes kept flicking between them and Silas, as if counting how many adults might hold the rope this time so she wouldn't fall alone in the dark. On Wednesday, Lila answered a question before Crowley could ignore her, and the room froze, but Lila's voice stayed steady, and the answer was right, so Crowley had to nod, tight-lipped, and write her name on the board, proving silence isn't always the winner. Lila sat back, pounding proud. At the Mercantile, Catherine Vale's mother crossed paths with Silas, and she didn't smile, but she didn't sneer either, and she greeted Lila with a stiff nod. Because even proud women notice when a child stands up clean and the town begins adjusting its story. Silas filed away for later. That evening, Lila asked if the letter meant she'd go back to stacked bunks, and Silas didn't answer fast, because fast answers can be lies. So he said, "We're building proof, and proof takes time, but I'm here and I'm not stepping aside." She leaned into him, breathing to believe. Towns like this call themselves decent, yet they test decency on the backs of the easiest targets. And an orphan girl's easy because she has no grandfather to glare back, so Silas decided he'd glare for her, and Lila decided she'd keep walking anyway. That's how things change slowly. Thursday night, Silas walked into the town meeting, hat in hand, and the room went still because he never showed yet. He took a seat near the front, and when someone mentioned children from back east, he spoke once saying, "They're not stock, they're souls." A men looked away, ashamed. On Sunday, the Ladies' Aid women gathered Lila in the church basement, and they didn't lecture. They asked her to read a passage, then they praised her voice, and when a boy snickered, Margaret Hale snapped, "Kindness is the rule here," and the snicker died. Lila blinked surprise, then smiled. Miss Crowley heard about the petition, and she began watching Lila like a hawk waiting for missteps. Yet Lila's careful manners gave her nothing, and when Crowley scolded her for speaking out of turn, Lila said, "Yes, ma'am," and wrote the answer anyway. That defiance was new and steadied her. One night on the porch, Lila asked why being chosen mattered so much, and Silas said, "Because choice is a promise, and promises are the fences that hold when the world tries to push you back into the pen you escaped," and she nodded, understanding more than a kid should. Rumors started naming suspects: the preacher, the store clerk, a jealous widow, yet the petition stayed unsigned, and that anonymity made it meaner because you can't stare down a shadow. So Silas told Lila not to chase ghosts, just keep living steady and let truth build weight day by day. Lila asked if she should be perfect for court, and Silas snapped not at her. At the idea, saying perfect is a trick, and if any judge wants a perfect child, he's buying a story, not raising a human, so you be yourself and we'll stand on that. Every time. When a younger girl tripped outside school spilling books into mud, Lila knelt and helped, even as other kids laughed, and she brushed pages clean with her sleeve because she knew humiliation, and she refused to pass it on, and one teacher's aide noticed, quietly approving. Lila walked on steady. By the end of the month, Silas noticed small nods on Main Street, not friendship, just recognition. And those nods mattered because they meant the town was beginning to accept the idea that Lila belonged, and belonging is the first shield a child gets outside home. She felt it exhaled. Silas remembered that moment at the social when Lila spoke and the room listened, and he understood something he'd missed for years. That respect isn't bought by land alone, it's earned by showing up for the vulnerable in public without flinching every time. That lesson settled, like cold setting in. If you ever wondered why a child would rather face stones than ask for rescue, it's because pride is the last thing nobody can auction off, and Lila guarded hers, fierce, while Silas learned real protection sometimes means restraint and sometimes means stepping forward in turns. They learn in timing together. Still, that petition sat like a rattlesnake in the grass, and even as small friendships formed, the law was coming, so Silas lit the porch lamp, kissed Lila's braid with his knuckles, and said, "Sleep, kid, tomorrow we start proving and we don't stop." Town watched, and we watched back. Silas rode into town and hired Hawthorne the lawyer with ink-stained fingers. Hawthorne read the petition, and his mouth tightened like a gate in wind. He said, "Isolation looks bad, and courts like neighbors' letters and witnesses." Silas nodded once and felt his own fences closing around him hard. He bought a notebook and wrote daily notes like a ranch log book. Lila watched him write and asked if words could keep her home. Silas said words help because judges trust paper more than promises sometimes. Mrs. Lynn brewed tea and told Lila to breathe slow and steady. She said fear lies loud, but truth grows quiet if tended daily. Lila nodded again and held Molly like thread could anchor her heart. Silas visited the schoolhouse and asked for Lila's slate work politely. Miss Crowley frowned at him and said, "Records require procedure, not sentiment." Silas answered calmly and paid for new books without flinching once. He asked about stones, and Crowley looked away, pretending she hadn't noticed. Silas didn't argue further and decided restraint would serve Lila better. He spoke to the boys' fathers, and his voice stayed low but firm. Some men apologized quickly, and some men blamed Lila because pride hates shame. Silas remembered that and wrote their names without promising revenge or drama. Hawthorne said stay clean because rage can look reckless before a court. Silas agreed and swallowed fire the way ranchers swallow dust in storms. Mrs. Lynn gathered ladies' aid women, and they arrived with serious eyes. Margaret Hale led them, and she spoke plain with grief under her kindness. She said, "We'll sign letters and we'll show up if needed." Lila listened quietly, and her shoulders lifted, like a load shifted slightly. One woman brought soap and another brought wool because care's practical. Mrs. Lynn measured Lila again and promised a coat before first snow. Silas bought boots and chose soft leather because blisters teach nothing useful. He asked Lila her favorite color, and she hesitated, then whispered green. Silas bought green ribbon and acted casual, though his chest felt tight. Lila braided it in and stood taller without realizing she had. Hawthorne visited the ranch and inspected rooms like a man counting evidence. He noted the pantry and the quilts and the lamp kept low. He asked about discipline, and Silas said, "Talking first because fear teaches nothing." Hawthorne nodded slowly and wrote that down with a sharp scratched pen. Mrs. Lynn showed Lila's meals and pointed at fuller cheeks with quiet pride. Tommy Rourke offered testimony and said, "Silas keeps promises, even when stubborn. He said the ranch runs honest and workers stay because Mercer pays fair." Hawthorne warned them all that court questions cut, so keep answers steady. Lila practiced speaking, and Mrs. Lynn corrected posture without scolding her once. She said look forward, not down, 'cause down invites wolves to circle. Silas listened from the doorway and learned how courage can be taught. He asked Lila to read aloud, and she chose a hymn softly. Her voice shook at first, and then it steadied like water, finding channel. Silas said that's good, and his praise came small, but it landed. Lila asked if she must testify, and Hawthorne said maybe if needed. Silas hated that idea and felt helpless, like watching lightning over dry grass. Mrs. Lynn said children can speak truth when adults stop speaking for them. Margaret Hale agreed and promised she'd stand nearby like a human wall. The week before court, Silas attended church despite every instinct to flee. He sat in back and kept hat in hand, because manners matter there. Some folks stared hard, and some folks nodded, surprised he'd shown it all. Lila sat beside Mrs. Lynn and listened. Learning community can be built slowly. After service, Margaret introduced Lila and forced names into familiarity one by one. A baker offered cookies, and Lila accepted, because refusal would look afraid. Silas watched that exchange and felt gratitude like warm coffee after cold riding. Hawthorne collected those moments and said judges like patterns, not miracles. Silas wrote in the notebook and counted days like counting calves in spring. Lila asked if time helps, and Silas said it can if we endure. She answered, I can endure, and Silas believed her because she already had. The night before court, Lila couldn't sleep, and Silas made warm milk. He said, whatever happens, you won't be alone, and he meant it fully. Lila asked if he'd be ashamed, and Silas said, never not of you. He added, I'm ashamed of silence, the kind I lived with too long. Lila leaned against him, and the porch lamp glowed steady as promise. Morning arrived frosted, and the wagon rolled toward town carrying their whole future. Mrs. Lynn rode with Lila, and Tommy rode behind like back up against storm. Margaret and the ladies' aid followed, their faces set like churchwomen on mission. Silas kept his hands steady and breathed slow because nerves can spook horses. The courthouse looked squat, and the flag snapped in a cold, clean wind. Inside benches filled early because towns love drama dressed as concern. Silas saw familiar faces, and he forced himself not to glare too hard. Hawthorne greeted him quietly and adjusted his tie like ritual against chaos. Judge Arlen Pritchard entered, and the room rose, then settled in silence. Pritchard looked over spectacles, and his eyes were sharp but not cruel. He stated the case and said child welfare matters more than pride or gossip. Hawthorne stood first and described Lila's condition before she came to ranch. He spoke of thin arms and fearful habits without using lurid details. He emphasized progress and routine and the safety promised, then delivered daily. Opposing counsel appeared named Conrad Rusk with a smile like polished brass. Rusk spoke of suitability and tradition and the need for proper households. Silas felt anger rise, and Hawthorne touched his sleeve, reminding restraint again. Rusk called Silas isolated and implied he wanted labor, not family. Hawthorne objected softly, and Judge Pritchard allowed evidence, not insults, today. Mrs. Lynn took the stand, and her voice stayed calm like steady stitching. She said Lila eats and laughs and sleeps and asks questions now. Rusk asked about wages, and Lynn answered, Truth isn't for sale, sir. Rusk questioned a woman's place, and Lynn replied, Care has no borders here. Judge Pritchard watched Lynn and seemed to respect her spine and clarity. Tommy testified next and spoke of Silas's fairness across 20 hard years. He said Silas runs clean books and keeps workers safe through winters. Russ tried to paint bias, and Tommy said I'd speak free anyway. Margaret Hale testified, and her words carried weight like church bells at dusk. She said she'd seen love, and she recognized it in Silas and Lila. Rusk asked about mothers, and Margaret replied, community mothers exist when needed. She said tradition matters less than protection and steady showing up daily. Judge Pritchard nodded slightly, and the room shifted, sensing tides turning slowly. Rusk introduced rumors and claimed Lila was troublesome because she answered back. Hawthorne replied, Trouble isn't a sin when a child fights to be seen. He asked for school papers and presented Lila's sums neat and correct. Miss Crowley had signed them grudgingly, which made the evidence stronger. Rusk asked why Crowley disliked Lila, and Hawthorne said prejudice explains itself. Judge Pritchard warned Rusk that cruelty at school reflects adults, not children. The room went quiet, and Lila's hands trembled in her lap. Hawthorne whispered the next step, and Silas felt dread, thick as mud. He called Lila to stand, and her small boots clicked on courthouse wood. Lila walked to the witness chair and sat straight with Molly held close. Judge Pritchard softened his eyes and asked if she understood truth today. Lila said yes, sir, and her voice carried despite fear inside. He asked if she felt safe, and Lila answered yes, at home. He asked what home meant, and Lila said, where I'm not afraid. Rusk approached and spoke gently because wolves sometimes wear velvet words. He asked if Silas ever yelled, and Lila said sometimes, but never cruel. He asked about punishment, and Lila said talking and learning and trying again. Rusk asked about friends, and Lila admitted school was hard still. He asked why no friends, and Lila said some kids were taught to hate. Rusk suggested a family elsewhere with sisters and motherly influence and comfort. Lila's face paled and her fingers clenched Molly like rope against falling. She said, I want this home because Silas chose me when nobody did. Rusk pressed about choice, and Lila replied, choice means promise, not pity. She said, I'm not a project, I'm a person with a name. Judge Pritchard asked her name, and she said Lila Hart for now. She added quietly, maybe Mercer someday if that's allowed and wanted. Silas swallowed hard and kept his face steady so she could stand. Rusk asked if she feared losing Silas, and Lila said every day. She said fear doesn't mean doubt. It means I remember what leaving feels. Judge Pritchard thanked her and told her to return to her seat. Lila walked back slowly, and Margaret's hand hovered without grabbing her pride. Hawthorne gave closing words and asked the court to honor steady care. Rusk argued tradition and implied risk because single men can fail. Hawthorne answered, anyone can fail, but evidence shows Silas is trying daily. Judge Pritchard paused long, and the room held breath like horses sensing thunder. He said he'd review carefully and issue decision within 1 hard week. He ordered Lila remain with Silas until written ruling arrived. Silas felt relief and fear tangled together like rope in a hurried hand. Outside the courthouse, wind cut cold and townsfolk whispered, but softer now. Margaret told Lila she was brave, and Lila believed it a little. Mrs. Lynn hugged her once, brief and firm, then stepped back, respectful. Silas thanked them all, and his voice cracked because gratitude was new. Hawthorne reminded Silas, keep routines because waiting can poison the mind. Silas nodded and drove home with Lila quiet beside him, thinking hard. At supper, Mrs. Lynn served stew, and nobody spoke much because words felt fragile. Lila asked if the judge liked her, and Silas said he listened. She said listening is rare, and Silas agreed, then promised to keep listening. Days passed slow, and Silas worked fences, counting minutes like coins. Lila went to school and held her head steady because court taught her. Some children stopped throwing stones because adults were watching closer now. Catherine Vale offered a shy hello, and Lila answered careful but polite. Miss Crowley remained cold, but she called on Lila once, begrudgingly. Lila answered right, and the room saw it, and silence shifted again. At home, Silas read stories, and his voice warmed without him noticing. Mrs. Lynn corrected his rhythm, and he accepted it because pride was useless. One afternoon, the courier returned carrying an envelope with a wax seal. Silas's hand shook, and he hated that, then opened it anyway. He read the decision twice, and his eyes blurred, then cleared. He whispered, she stays, and Mrs. Lynn crossed herself, grateful and fierce. Lila looked up fast and asked, what does it say, Silas? Tell me. Silas said, you're home. And his voice broke like ice finally cracking. Lila ran into his arms and sobbed, not pretty, but honest. Silas held her tight and said, I've got you, I've got you. Mrs. Lynn wiped her eyes and pretended she had flour on her hands. That night Margaret arrived with pie because joy needs sweetness to sit with. Tommy brought cider, and the ranch hands cheered outside like a good branding day. Lila laughed through tears and ate too much because fear had starved her. Silas watched her eat and decided he'd never let hunger own her again. After dishes, Lila asked if Law could try again, and Lynn said unlikely. Hawthorne said the ruling holds weight unless new evidence appears later. Lila exhaled and leaned on Silas like a child finally resting. Silas stared at the lamp and realized the house had changed forever. He asked Lila what she wanted next, and she said a name. Silas swallowed hard and said, I've been thinking about adoption if you want. Lila's eyes went wide, and she whispered, really, like it was forbidden. Silas said, really, and he meant permanent, legal, and chosen for both. Mrs. Lynn smiled and said, about time, you stubborn man, you finally admit love. Lila laughed once, and the laugh sounded like spring after long winter. Silas didn't speak the word adoption like it was a promise he could toss into the air and hope it landed soft. He said it like a man laying a hand on a brand new fence post, testing if the ground would hold, because he knew one wrong shove could crack what they'd built. Lila stared at him, eyes wide and wet, and for a moment she looked 8 again, not the old-eyed child who'd learned to measure every room for danger. Mrs. Lynn kept wiping her hands on her apron, as if she'd suddenly forgotten what to do with them, and Margaret Hale sat quiet, letting the moment belong to the girl. Silas cleared his throat, then he tried again, slower. He said he didn't want paper to be the only reason she stayed. He said he wanted it to be choice. Lila whispered. I thought you already chose me. Silas nodded once, and he said he had, but the world didn't always respect a choice unless it was written in ink and stamped by a judge. Lila looked down at Molly, and her fingers traced the doll's repaired seam as if thread could teach her what the forever felt like. She asked if adoption meant people couldn't take her away again. Mrs. Lynn answered before Silas could, saying it meant the town would have to fight the law itself, and the law doesn't like being pushed without reason. Margaret added that it also meant Lila would have a name that matched the door she walked through at night. Silas watched Lila swallow the way she swallowed fear, the way she swallowed hope, and he realized hope was harder for her than fear. He said he wouldn't rush her. He said he'd ask and he'd wait for her answer because he was done dragging children through decisions like sacks of grain. Lila looked up and her voice came out thin. She said, I want it, Silas, but I'm scared to want it. Silas answered, that's honest, and honest is what we do here. He told her she didn't have to be perfect to be kept. He told her he didn't want perfect anyway because perfect was a lie people sold when they didn't know how to love what was real. Lila blinked fast, then she nodded, that sharp little nod she used when she was gathering her courage like a coat around her shoulders. She said, I want your name if you'll have me. Silas's mouth tightened and his eyes shone, and he tried to pretend it was smoke in the lamp light, but nobody in that kitchen believed him. Mrs. Lynn stepped forward, set a hand on Lila's shoulder, and said, then it's settled. Margaret smiled, and she said the ladies' aid would make noise if anyone tried to shame it. Silas took a breath that felt like the first full breath he'd taken in years. Then he said he'd ride into town the next day to see Hawthorne and start the papers. Lila asked if there would be another hearing. Silas told her there would, but it would be quieter, not a spectacle, more like a man signing a contract with his own heart. Lila whispered, I don't like courtrooms. Silas answered, I don't either, kid, but we'll walk through it together. The next morning came cold, and the sky had that washed-out look that means winter's settling in for real. Silas hitched the team, and he told Lila she'd stay with Mrs. Lynn because lawyer offices weren't built for children's nerves. Lila didn't argue, but she stood on the porch watching him like she was afraid the road might swallow him and never spit him back. Silas hated that look because it reminded him how much leaving had trained her. He tipped his hat, told her he'd be back before supper, and he forced a smile because sometimes a child needs a lie that points towards safety. Mrs. Lynn guided Lila inside, set her to knead and dough, and said, hands busy, keep fear from running wild. Lila kneaded, and she listened for wagon sounds, and she tried to believe them when they told her he'd return. In town, Hawthorne had his desk cluttered with papers, and his face looked tired in the winter light. Silas laid the petition ruling down first because he liked facts in front of him. Hawthorne read it, then nodded, saying the custody fight was won, and the adoption was a new road with fewer potholes if they stayed careful. Silas asked what careful meant. Hawthorne said it meant documentation witnesses and a home inspection because judges like routine in courts love proof more than stories. Silas muttered he'd never liked people snooping his house. Hawthorne said that was too bad because once you ask the law to recognize a family, you invite the law to look inside it. Silas didn't flinch. He just said, fine, then we'll show them what they need to see. Hawthorne wrote down names Mrs. Lynn, Tommy Rourke, Margaret Hale, and 2 ladies' aid women with clean reputations. He also asked for a school report because education looks good on paper, and judges want to see a child thriving, not just surviving. Silas asked what to do about Miss Crowley. Hawthorne said Crowley didn't have to like the girl, she just had to sign the truth. Silas didn't love that, but he understood it. He signed a stack of forms, paid the fees, then walked out into the cold with his shoulders tight and his mind already listing tasks. On the ride home, he stopped at the Mercantile, bought a new wool coat for Lila, not too fancy, just sturdy. And he chose green ribbon again because she'd whispered green like it was a secret she was allowed to have. He also bought a small leather notebook, not for himself but for her, because he'd seen how she watched words hungry for meaning. He didn't emboss a name on it because he wasn't tempting fate, not yet. He just tucked it under his coat and headed back to the ranch. When he rolled into the yard, Lila was already on the porch, dough flour still dusting her fingers. She tried to stand still, but her body leaned forward like it was reaching for reassurance. Silas climbed down, and before he could say a word, she asked, did it work? He told her it started. He told her there was a path, and paths are what ranchers understand, one hoof print at a time. Mrs. Lynn came out behind her eyes sharp, and she asked if the lawyer had any foolishness to add. Silas said he wanted a school report, and Lynn nodded, already thinking 3 steps ahead like women do. Lila's shoulders eased, not because the danger was gone, but because the work had shape now. Silas handed her the coat, and she touched it like it might burn. She asked if it was really hers. Silas said it was, and he said that word slow hers, as if teaching her that possession could mean safety instead of guilt. He gave her the notebook, too, and she opened it, ran her fingers over blank pages, then whispered, it's empty. Silas answered, that means it's waiting for you. Lila looked up, eyes shining, and she said, like your house was waiting for me. Silas swallowed, then he said, yeah, a kid like that. The weeks that followed weren't the kind of weeks folks sing about. They were ordinary, and ordinary is how healing hides. Lila went to school, came home, did sums help Mrs. Lynn cook, and learned where things belonged in a house that didn't punish her for moving. Silas worked fences, checked cattle, and started showing up in town more than he ever had because he was done letting his own isolation become Lila's problem. He attended a town meeting, sat in the front, and when someone complained about orphan trains, Silas said those kids weren't merchandise, they were children. He didn't make a speech, he just said it once, then fell quiet, and that quiet had weight. Some men looked away embarrassed, and some men looked mad, but nobody argued because Silas Mercer didn't waste words unless he meant them. At school, Miss Crowley stayed cold, but she started calling on Lila once in a while because after the court ruling, every adult in town knew eyes were on them. Lila answered right, and the room heard it, and that matters, because kids follow what adults reward even when they pretend they don't. The Morrison children began sitting near Lila more often, not out of pity, but because she'd proven she was steady, and steady is rare in a world full of show. One day, the youngest Morrison girl gave Lila a small knitted mitten, saying her mother made it, and Lila took it like it was a medal. She didn't cry in front of them, but she did keep the mitten in her pocket all afternoon, rubbing it like a worry stone. When she got home, she placed it beside Molly on the dresser, as if building a small museum of belonging. Silas saw it and said nothing because sometimes saying nothing is the gentlest respect. Then the storm came. It came fast the way Montana storms do, with wind that sounded like it was mad at the whole world and snow that swallowed roads like a blanket thrown hard. Silas drove into town that morning because he'd promised Lila he'd pick her up himself. He didn't trust the weather. By noon, the sky turned heavy and the schoolhouse windows went gray, and the teacher dismissed everyone early because no lesson is worth freezing on a road. Parents arrived with wagons and sleds calling names, gathering children like hens gathering chicks. But 3 kids stayed behind, huddled near the stove because their father was away and their mother was home with a new baby too far to walk in a whiteout. Lila watched them, and she felt that old familiar fear of being the last one waiting the forgotten one. She didn't let it happen to them. She stepped up to Crowley's desk and said, "My father's coming, he can take them." Crowley blinked, surprise flickering. Then she nodded tight, as if generosity from Lila didn't fit her story of the girl. When Silas arrived, snow already piling, Lila rushed out, explained in quick sentences, and Silas didn't hesitate. He said, "Get in, all of you," and he wrapped blankets around them. Blankets Mrs. Lynn insisted on packing that morning like she'd smelled trouble. The road to the Morrison homestead was hard, and Silas kept the team slow steady using fence lines and memory to guide when the world turned white. No heroics, no grand talk, just working care, because that's what saving looks like most days. When they reached the cabin, Mrs. Morrison came out crying, relief plain on her face, and she hugged her children, then turned to Lila and Silas, not knowing what to say. Silas said no repayment needed, and Lila said, "We help when we can, because my father taught me that." Mrs. Morrison looked at Silas then, and her eyes changed because the town had called him cold. But cold men don't drive children through a storm for no reason. They got back to the ranch after dark, soaked and tired, and Mrs. Lynn had stew waiting because she believed in feeding fear out of a body. Lila ate cheeks pink from cold and pride, and when she went to bed, she fell asleep fast, the kind of sleep that comes when you've done something right. The storm lasted 3 days, and when school resumed, the Morrison boy sat beside Lila at lunch like it was the most natural thing in the world. 2 other kids drifted over acting casual, because kids don't like admitting they changed their mind. Lila didn't push, she just made room. That's a lesson some grown folks never learn, but she did because she knew what it felt like to have no room anywhere. Later that week, Catherine Vale approached Lila by the water pump, eyes down, and she said her mother told her to apologize for cruel words. Lila studied her, not trusting quick apologies. Then she asked, "Do you mean it?" Catherine swallowed, then said yes, and she said she'd been wrong, and that being chosen sounded better than being born into a house that taught you to be mean. Lila didn't forgive her like flipping a switch. She said, "You can prove it," and Catherine nodded because that was fair. Silas heard about it at supper, and he said forgiveness is a gift, kid, but trust is earned. Lila nodded, then smiled, because hearing him speak like that felt like hearing a father, even if neither of them said the word out loud that night. As winter deepened, Hawthorne came to inspect the house, walking through rooms with a careful eye. He noted the pantry, the clean bedding the lamp kept low in the hall, and the way Lila moved through the kitchen like she belonged there. He asked about discipline, and Silas said talking and fixing and trying again. He asked about support, and Mrs. Lynn answered that Lila had a circle now, women, neighbors, friends at school, and that circle mattered. Hawthorne wrote it down. Then he said the hearing would be set in early December, and it would be brief. Silas nodded, but Lila looked pale because courtrooms still smelled like losing to her. Silas sat with her that night by the lamp, and he said he couldn't promise life would never scare her again. He said he could promise that fear wouldn't be something she faced alone in the dark anymore. Lila leaned against him and she whispered, "I'm trying to believe in forever." Silas answered, "You don't have to believe it all at once. You can believe it one day at a time, same as a fence line." The adoption hearing came on a clear, cold morning, the kind where the sun looks bright, but the air bites your lungs. Silas wore his best coat, Lila wore the green dress with lace collar, and Mrs. Lynn pinned her hair with that green ribbon like it was a banner. Margaret Hale came too, and so did 2 ladies' aid women, because they wanted the court to see Lila wasn't alone in the world anymore. The courtroom wasn't packed this time because the scandal seekers had lost interest once the custody fight ended, but a few eyes still watched because towns always watch. Judge Arlen Pritchard sat high, spectacles low, and he looked at Silas and Lila with the kind of measured attention that makes you feel seen. He asked Lila if she understood what adoption meant. Lila answered steady, saying it meant Silas would be her real father, legally and permanently, and it meant she'd have his name and his home and she'd keep him. Pritchard asked Silas if he understood what he was choosing. Silas said he did, and he said the child was already his daughter in every way that mattered, and he wanted the law to catch up to the truth. Mrs. Lynn sniffed like she was holding back a sermon, and Margaret smiled. Pritchard read the papers, then signed, and the sound of his pen scratching might as well have been a gate swinging open. He declared the adoption legal and binding. He said Lila Mercer, and the name hit the room like warm light. Lila's eyes went wide, and she looked at Silas as if she couldn't believe the world had said yes for once. Silas stood, cleared his throat, and he said out loud for anyone who wanted to hear, "Lila Mercer is my daughter." Lila laughed a real laugh, and she said, "Say it again." Silas shook his head, then said it again anyway, because he'd learned some joys are worth repeating. They celebrated small, not because they lacked money, But because Silas didn't trust loud joy yet, Mrs. Lynn made dumplings and stew, Margaret brought apple pie, and Tommy Rourke brought cider, and the ranch hands gathered in the kitchen like it was a holiday. Lila ate until she was full, then she ate another bite, anyway, because fear had taught her to hoard good things. Silas watched her, and he felt something settle in him. He felt like his house was finally being used for what it was built for, not just shelter, but life. After supper, Lila asked what happened now. Silas said, "Now we live." He said she'd go to school, he'd run the ranch, Mrs. Lynn would keep them both from starving, and they'd keep building. Lila asked if she could write her new name in the notebook. Silas said she could write it 100 times if she wanted. Lila wrote it once, slow, careful, then traced the letters with her finger like a prayer. Winter went on, and it wasn't easy because life doesn't become a fairy tale just because a judge signs paper. Miss Crowley stayed stiff, and some kids stayed mean, but fewer, because cruelty is harder when a town starts watching itself. Lila learned to skate on the frozen pond behind the barn, holding Silas's hands while she wobbled, and both of them laughed when they fell. Mrs. Lynn taught her how to make bread that didn't burn, and how to mend socks before they became holes, and how to keep a house warm without making it feel like a prison. Tommy taught her how to read clouds, how to listen to a horse's breathing, and how to throw a rope without snapping her wrist. Silas taught her the quiet things, how to keep a promise, how to face a room of judgment without flinching, and how to do the next right task even when your stomach is tight with fear. And Lila taught Silas something he didn't expect, that love doesn't arrive as a lightning bolt, it arrives as repetition. A chair pulled out at breakfast, a lamp left on a coat buttoned, a name spoken with pride. When spring returned, the land softened and the ranch came alive with calving season. Lila followed Silas into the barn, eager to help, and Silas tried to keep her out of hard moments, but she insisted she could stand steady. One morning, a cow struggled, and Silas worked careful, and Lila stood at the cow's head, murmuring soft words the way she'd seen Mrs. Lynn soothe frightened things. When the calf came safe, Lila grinned like she'd just won a battle, and Silas realized here she liked being useful for something good, not just obedient for survival. The twin calves that season became her project, and she named them Star and Stripe, and she fed them with a bottle when the cow couldn't handle both. Tommy warned her, calves get sold, that's ranch life, and Lila nodded, saying, the time we have still matters. Silas heard that and felt his throat tighten, because it meant she'd learned something important, that love can be real even when it doesn't last forever. But that didn't mean forever wasn't worth trying for. By summer, Lila had friends, not a crowd, just a few steady ones, and that was enough. Catherine Vale became less sharp, more thoughtful, and she started defending Lila when other kids tried to get mean. The Morrison children invited Lila to fish at the creek, and she came home muddy and laughing, and Mrs. Lynn scolded her, then smiled behind her back. Silas watched all of it like a man watching grass return after drought, slow and unbelievable, but real. He started attending socials without being dragged, not because he loved them, but because he loved what they did for Lila. People began greeting them on Main Street with nods that weren't pity, and that mattered more than smiles. On Lila's 9th birthday, Mrs. Lynn and Margaret planned a party, and Silas tried to pretend he didn't notice, but he noticed everything. The house filled with voices, ranch hands, and families. Ladies aid women, the Morrison kids, Catherine too, and for a moment the Mercer house didn't feel like a fortress at all. It felt like a home that had always been meant to hold this kind of noise. They lit candles on a cake, and Silas told Lila to make a wish. She closed her eyes a long time, then blew them out in one breath. And when someone asked what she wished for, she looked at Silas and said, she wished it stayed real. Silas answered loud enough for the room, it's real, and you're stuck with us, kid. No waking up from this one. Lila laughed, and the laugh sounded like someone finally letting go of a tight fist. Now I'll tell you what I've learned watching stories like theirs stretch across years. The West likes to pretend it's only made of grit and guns, but that's a half-truth, and half-truths get people killed. The West is also made of kitchens and quilts and women who show up with soup when a child comes home with bruised pride. It's made of men who learn to hold their anger so a child can hold her dignity. It's made of choices that feel foolish at first until you realize foolish love is often the only thing that stands between a child and the cold. Silas Mercer didn't become a good father because he suddenly turned soft. He became a good father because he stayed. He stayed when the town talked. He stayed when court papers tried to pull Lila back into a stacked bunk bed world. He stayed when he didn't know what to say, and he learned to say, I am here. And Lila Mercer didn't heal because the world got kinder overnight. She healed because one man and a handful of stubborn women refused to let the world define her as unwanted. They treated her as a person, not a problem. They gave her room to grow, and they protected her without turning her into a charity story. They let her earn trust at her own speed because trust doesn't gallop, it walks. So here's the part I want you to sit with if you've got a warm cup in your hand and a few miles behind you in life. How many times have you seen someone standing quiet on their known platform, not wood boards, but the kind of platform loneliness builds and you looked away because it wasn't your problem? How many times have you told yourself you were too tired, too busy, too set in your ways to make room for one more soul? Silas thought he was too set too. He was wrong. And being wrong saved 2 lives, not by magic, but by daily work. If you've got someone in your world who's been carrying fear like a sack of stones, check on them, not with a speech, just with a steady question and a steady presence. And if you're the one carrying those stones, take a breath, drink some water, and remember this, you don't have to earn the right to be treated decent. You're allowed to need help, you're allowed to rest, you're allowed to belong. I can't promise every story ends clean. Out here, nothing does, but I can tell you this. When a man chooses to stop walking past pain and a child chooses to trust 1 inch more than fear, demands that's where a real West story starts. And if you were Silas, would you have stepped onto that platform knowing it might crack your heart open for good? And if you were Lila, would you have dared to say yes to a new name after the world taught you names were temporary?